Hello and welcome. You're watching Global Insight with me, Arirang. From Arirang News Centre in Seoul, we speak with experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. Is globalization on the verge of collapse? Now, that's been a question that's been constantly asked throughout 2020 as travel bans and border closures emphasised the growing division between countries that really preceded the COVID-19 pandemic. The question didn't come out of nowhere. Since the global financial crisis of 2008, there has been a growing sense of aversion to the free flow of goods, services and capital around the world, as a minority profited tremendously from the system, while the majority were left behind when it collapsed. As we head into 2021, into what will hopefully become a post-pandemic world, we pose the same question, and really there's no one better to ask than the renowned Canadian writer and political philosopher, John Ralston Saul. Mr. Saul's award-winning books have been translated into 28 languages, and Time magazine has called him a prophet for his compelling insights and accurate predictions of our times. Welcome back on the show, Mr. Saul. It's wonderful to have you again.
Well, it's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And well, since we last spoke, some major changes have taken place just a little south of where you are in North America. Joe Biden was elected President of the United States, ending the Donald Trump era of America First, which really undermined global trade norms and alliances while empowering undemocratic strongmen. Now, Mr. Biden's foreign policy agenda aims to place the United States back at the head of the table, as he said, to work with its allies and partners and mobilize action on global threats to security, freedom and democracy, human rights. So it really sounds like Mr. Biden wants to return to the heydays of liberal democracy, led by an American hegemony, of course. But does this sound realistic to you?
Well, I mean, he's got a real problem, which is that Trump took advantage of the failure of the liberal class, if you like, to be realistic about what was happening inside the United States, because there was this elite, whether it was economists or businessmen or whatever, who loved the structure of globalization because it meant fewer taxes, it meant a theory which was basically a right-wing theory, and it meant the weakening of governments. And the result was that a large part of the population did become furious, as it became furious in other countries. And so now he's got power, but he can't turn his back on how upset the working class, lower middle class of the United States are. So, he's not going to walk away from the America First motto of Trump. I mean, he's going to try to be a proper international leader. The United States is no longer what it was. Even under Obama, they had to really negotiate their situation as leaders. People don't really, they're going to be happy that Biden's there, but they don't trust the direction of the United States. And they know how strong that voter group is that followed Trump and that would follow someone like that again. So I don't think it's at all clear how easy it's going to be for Joe Biden to be. He'll be the friendly leader of the world. But that doesn't make him the United States the leader of a hegemony at all anymore, except in military terms. And finally, they've got a real question, which is they slipped, as Britain did, as other people did to some extent, down this road of being, the more advanced you were economically, the more you slipped into financial dealings and away from production. Trump's tried to bring them back to production. I think Biden will have to do the same because of what the unemployment looks like. So it's still going to be very, very tense, I think, between the United States and the rest of the world.
And as you said, sir, the world, it did welcome Biden's election to the presidency. And while he said that America is back to the world, but as you pointed out again, the world isn't the same. And in this world, do you think European powers like maybe Germany and what were traditionally seen as middle powers like South Korea, Canada and Australia, do you think these countries will have a bigger say in the new post-pandemic world order? Do you think it's going to become more multipolar?
It should. No, it definitely should. What's been fascinating through this period since what, the beginning of the year, is that the people who control the situation, the people who benefited under globalization, have generally speaking, and my impression is it's true almost everywhere. You would have to speak for Korea, but my impression is it's true almost everywhere, is they've tried to change the subject each time there's talk about the importance of change, of governing in a different way, of running the economy in a different way, of engaging in a new kind of economics, which would have big implications on the role of government, the role of taxation, how competition works. And, they've managed to delay serious changes all the way through. So nothing very profound has changed in spite of this second gigantic crisis after 2008. And I think a lot of those who control the biggest corporations believe that if they can just delay it a bit more, with a bit of doing a bit of good here and there and saying nice things and having nice advertisements, that if they could just get into the era of the vaccinations, that they'll have got through it. And the risks of higher taxes and the breaking up of oligopolies and monopolies will have passed. And that's a real challenge that we're faced. And if we don't face those things, then countries, middle powers like Korea, like Canada, and Australia, many others, will have lost our chance to play our role because the power structures will not have profoundly changed. Now, if nothing changes, I think there'll be enormous discomfort out there. And I don't know will that lead to violence? What that will lead to, we don't really know. But nothing has changed so far.
And as you said, some discontent has been stirring up across all societies around the world, and a lot of big problems that really need to be addressed were left hanging. The questions were just left hanging. And to fill this gap, countries like maybe Russia and China, they've used statecraft and malign influence to really advance their interests and undermine democracies during this time. And it looks like the world's traditional powers have started banding more strongly against the Chinese and the Russians, though, over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you see these countries, these powers backing down, or do you think they'll even try to pretend to play by global rules at this point? How do you think they're going to really react to this alliance of nations against them?
Well, now I'm sounding completely pessimistic so far, but the way in which we've come at China has been so naive. I mean, Koreans know more about it than Westerners do, as do Taiwanese and so on, and Japanese. But the slowness with which people have come to deal with the reality of the Chinese situation. I say that as a former president of Penn International, and therefore have been looking for a long time at what happens to people who speak up in any way, shape, or form in China. We've come at it very slowly, and it's looking more and more like, I don't know, like very old-fashioned Manichaean approaches towards this is our enemy. Oh, we've identified our enemy. Now what can we do to our enemy? And that's probably not going to be the right way to go about it. China has a lot of tools, and it can play the game in a very complicated way. Russia doesn't have as many tools because its economy is not doing terribly well. But they have a lot of other tools, which they're using, and they're very conscious of how clever they're going to have to be, maybe to look like they're backing off when they're not really backing off. And a lot of this is going to turn on whether Europe can finally get its act together, and this is a very difficult time for them, get their act together in order to decide how they would handle Russia, how they would handle China. And I think they're still quite confused about those two powers. And although they would like the United States to come back to a leadership role, they don't trust them anymore. So this is an era of enormous confusion, and it's unlikely we're going to get out of this confusion in the next year, I would say.
And well, throughout this year, we've constantly had the question, is globalization dead? Is it on its last legs? And well, while people like Francis Fukuyama, they were hailing the end of history and they were really praising harmony among nations, you correctly predicted the collapse of globalism, as your book title goes, with the rise of discontent in countries among those who felt really left behind by the American-led elitist type of globalization. As jobs moved to emerging economies, wages fell stagnant and the well-to-do got richer and richer. And these people, they voted in the ultra-nationalist leaders, some of them notably autocratic. And we can't ignore that very recently more than 70 million Americans voted to re-elect Donald Trump. What does this tell us about the strength of globalism at this point?
Well, on the surface, it tells us that it's really over, very weak, that as we originally understood it, it's essentially over. But what we're seeing is the extent to which the people who benefited from it have delayed and delayed and delayed, as I said, and are trying to avoid any changes because they're desperate to keep the borders weak, not because they're anti-nationalists, but to keep the borders weak in order to keep the taxes down and to keep their wealth growing. So, what we haven't seen is any serious discussion about walking away from things like GDP as a measurement, even though everyone is saying it, we need to. Nobody with power is saying it or is willing to talk about how do you walk away from GDP. There's been almost no discussion, and there needs to be discussion of a different kind about what does work look like? What do jobs look like? If you don't, the old answer was if we don't need you to produce goods because we're producing too many goods, then we fire you, as opposed to saying, you and we have so succeeded in producing ways to produce a lot of goods that we now have more money and more free time. So we have to relook at how the money is divided, and we have to re-examine how the time is used. If there is no need for people to work 40 hours a week because of the machinery and so on, the answer is not to fire them and take their wages down. The answer is to say, we've won. It's a victory. How do we use that extra time and extra money so that it's divided up differently? So that, for example, everyone from workers on up have more time to be citizens, to be volunteers, which is a way of being a citizen, to be engaged in their societies, to pay attention to their families and so on. That discussion has been avoided throughout this crisis, to rethink our education. None of that is happening, and it has to happen. Otherwise, we're not going to come out of this in better shape. And the globalism that remains will be seen very bitterly, very much like the economic political situation that was put in place in the 19th century after the defeat of Napoleon by the princes. So it's very much what's happened today. And as you move through the 1830s and 40s, the elites went into total denial. And the result was a series of revolutions starting in 1848, where many people died, and it created the Communist Party, and it created enormous disorder, and it led to the world wars and so on. So if we're not careful, we're going to slide towards that kind of violence and disorder if we don't re-examine these fundamentals now. And COVID has given us the orders and the opportunity to examine them now.
To really turn crisis into an opportunity. And well, you mentioned some economic questions that were also being left unanswered. And well, all this time we've been listening to economists as if they are prophets, or as you said, doctors in a sense. And we've let markets define us as countries and individuals as actors of the economy, and our stake in it marks where we stand socially as well as the state of our well-being. And even as we look towards a post-COVID recovery, we've been asking, will it be V-shaped, U-shaped, L-shaped, relying on these economic forecasts and intelligence, as we say. But as you mentioned, we have very real problems on our hands. Like, how are people going to get their next paycheck? Can I pay for my child's iPad to get her affordable, good quality classes? So who should be really involved in this discussion to really solve inequality and poverty going forward?
Well, every 100 years or so, there's a big discussion about what have we accomplished? What have we got wrong? I mean, it happens internationally, nationally, locally. It happens in many ways. And what do we need to do to deal with the next 50 years, 25, 50, 100 years? And what's fascinating is the determination not to do that this time around, even though we know that since about 1990, there have been revolutionary changes in how we can run society, partly because of the internet, only partly, and because of all the new technologies in production and so on. And instead, we need to have that conversation about what are we going to do. I think it's self-evident we need to break up the large internet companies, just the way we broke up the big oil companies in the 100 or so years ago. We need to raise taxes in a way which is not aimed at the working class, the lower middle class, and even the middle class. We have to figure out ways to actually spread the cost of a successful society, which really means not simply that one's raising money on the rich, but that we're rethinking completely where money goes and how money is shared, and what all of that looks like. And that's not a left-wing argument. It's this is what you call, at a certain point, change becomes mainstream. Without that change, the whole thing falls apart. Just the way everything, the Roman Empire fell apart because they refused to make the changes that were necessary. Things fell apart, in the middle of the 19th century for that reason. And we're in the midst of all the signs that it's going to fall apart completely if we don't make the changes now.
And it seems quite clear that these big tech companies, they're really dominating data, daily life, and income as well. They're taking all the profits. And as you said, we really haven't talked about how it should be distributed or taxed, especially across borders. And well, also in the past, you've said that Western governments, they've not really taken the initiative of turning crisis into real change, and that they're trying to prevent imagination from getting into power. What kind of initiatives or imagination do you hope to see emerge from this global pandemic?
Well, one of the big things, it sounds like I'm walking away from your question, but I'm not. I mean, one of the really big things, we have to re-examine how education functions. And I think right from the beginning, we have to get away from the model that is really about breaking kids down and training them, the sort of utilitarian model, which I know is strong in Korea, but it's strong pretty well everywhere in different forms. And we have to say that given everything that's happening, given the increased technology, given the free time, which is really what it is, it shouldn't be unemployment and poverty, it should be free time and imagination. That's all about reimagining how society is going to function. And that can only be done if first we set about thinking about education, not in the old late 19th century, first half of the 20th century terms of training workers, of business schools that are going to train people to manage. All that is so old-fashioned and really out of it. We really have to be thinking about an education in which young people are communicating with each other on a second-by-second basis. And so the old, logical, utilitarian methods will not work in education and will not lead to imagination and change. So we have to rethink both our schools from the beginning, but also our universities and how they function. We have to rethink the role of imagination in education, because without imagination, we're not going to be able to create anything new. We're not going to be able to turn the corner. And I think we start, that's really one of the most important places. But, equally, the way governments run, the way they apply their programs, the way they deliver their programs, The way they treat businesses, where they expect businesses to be utilitarian only, is leading to less and less kind of imagination on what the relationships are going to be inside the business world. The whole management idea, which has dominated now for 75 years, is simply old-fashioned. It's out of date. And we need to be thinking not about business schools as they are today, but schools in which people who are going into the private sector are using their imaginations and thinking long-term. You know, there's an indigenous idea that is absolutely central in Canada, and I think it's in many places, indigenous populations, which is that you have to think, they put it, you have to think in terms of 7 generations. That when you're putting something in place, it's for 7 generations ahead. You know, it's a way of saying you have to think not quarterly or half yearly or yearly, but you really have to think, where are we going? What are we doing? Why are we doing these things?
So really across the globe, we really have to get to the root of the start of the problem, really, from education, where people are trained as units of production, and we're ranked and we're valued for our productivity and contribution to the economy. And the economy is not society in the full sense. And I think we learned quite a lot today from your insights there. Well, this is why
Can I just add to that if you look at the environmental crisis and the kind of sort of half-hidden opposition of the business class and the fear of the government classes that if they do too much, it'll hurt the economy, all of this is negative. Whereas the positive, and I'm not the first person to say this at all, the positive is to say, if we use our imaginations, we can think about how addressing the environmental situation will lead to a new kind of growth, an enormous creation of shared wealth, and a new approach towards society. It's fear of that which holds us back.
And really, we must overcome this fear and really put our heads together and let imagination run its course as we move forward into this post-pandemic world. Hopefully we will be moving forward. Well, I'm afraid this is where we must leave our discussion for today, sir. But thank you so much. That was award-winning author and philosopher John Ralston Saul. Thank you again so much for joining us from Toronto.
Wonderful to be back. Thank you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you for watching.